Why don't you guys give a round of applause to Dr. Christopher Jones?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Sorry, I'm a little casual this evening. I actually have another function to go to in about 90 minutes, so I'm not going to waste y'all's time hearing an old man ramble for a while. I just want to kind of give you a few, if I can get this thing to lock into place here. It's okay. It's fine. Yeah, I just want to give you a few opening thoughts because I know this is going to be an exciting debate this evening. And really, the whole reason I'm here is to just share for a couple of minutes about the importance of debate and civil and structured debate. Okay. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with the legendary economist, Nobel Prize winner, Kenneth Arrow. But Dr. Arrow developed a theorem which has become today to be known as Arrow's impossibility paradox or Arrow's impossibility theorem. And what it has to do with is how people make decisions in a collective or, public choice, basically voting. There's 6 fundamental criteria that Arrow defined that have to exist in order for effective decision making to occur basically in a democratic environment. The first one, he said, is there has to be criteria that leads to some kind of a decision, regardless of the preferences of voters. So there's got to be some sort of outcome. Otherwise, why the point? What's the point? The second one is that the rule can provide some sort of ranking of your preference. You like this choice better than this choice. If there's more than 2 choices, you can rank them 1, 2, 3, and so forth. The rule needs to be consistent with what you prefer. Don't vote for something or someone that you don't want to vote for. Sometimes that's really hard when you're not presented with a lot of good options, as we all know. But the fourth component has to do with this concept of transitivity that we talk about in economics all the time, which just simply means this. If you've got 3 choices, choice 1, 2, and 3, and you know you like choice 1 better than choice 2, and you like choice 2 better than choice 3, then by default you have to like choice 1 better than choice 3, okay? And then the 2 final conditions are that any ranking that you have of any 2 choices have to be independent of other alternatives that you would consider. And finally, the most important one is that you can't have a dictatorship in a democracy, okay? Well, given those 6 conditions and how Arrow analyzed all of them, he basically came up with his impossibility theorem, which simply states this. And it was a large reason why he was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. You find out at the end of the day that a lot of economists that get Nobel Prizes, they get them for concepts that are really sometimes kind of like, well, duh, I kind of knew that. But his impossibility theorem states that it's actually in a democratic or a collective environment impossible to come to a decision, an effective decision or an outcome if you have to strictly follow all 6 of those criteria. And he basically concluded that the only way you could have some sort of governing structure that could meet the first 5 is if you did have a dictatorship. Basically, a dictatorship being the most effective way to get things done in a society. Let that one sink in for a couple of minutes. What he was trying to say about with that impossibility theorem and his paradox is democracy's hard, ladies and gentlemen. It's messy. It takes time. You get imperfect answers. But, if we look back in history, we like to think a lot today about the fact that we're in, just terribly polarized and difficult times. Nothing's getting done in Washington. Everybody is at everybody else's throats. It just seems like we're on the verge of a societal breakdown, not only just here in the U.S., but throughout the world. We've been here before. In 1858, Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois debated candidate Abraham Lincoln 7 times in a year over the principal subject of slavery and whether or not slavery was going to be allowed to move forward into the newly acquired U.S. territories that came as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. Believe me, people were every bit as much at one another's throats back then as they are today, and we even went to war over it 3 years later. But in all of those debates, no matter how Lincoln, Douglas, the factions that supported each of them were polar opposites of one another, they respected what the other person had to say. And the decisions, and Lincoln made comments after he became president, where he stated that some of the substance that came out of those debates between he and Senator Douglas were some of the most valuable valuable experiences that he had in learning how to govern as the president of a nation that was at war with one another, trying to find a way to end it and bring it back together and end the cause of slavery altogether. So at the end of the day, my final comments to you before you get engaged in this debate would be this. No matter how much you're at the polar opposite end of someone that you disagree with or you debate with, respect them even if it seems as though they don't respect you. And I'm going to tell you why. I've been an economist for 30 years, just a few days short of my 55th birthday, okay? And for a big portion of that 30 years, running my firm, being in other locations, I do a lot of litigation work. I'm an expert witness. In fact, I have to go testify in a trial Monday morning at 9 o'clock. It's another reason I can't be here, because I got to spend the whole weekend prepping for that trial. Worked on over 75 cases over the course of my career, and one of the things that I've learned is that when you know the opinion of your adversary, you are much better prepared to defeat them than when you want to shut them down from ever speaking about what their position is. Okay? So everybody comes from a different position, a different perspective. Give them the time, listen to them, see what solutions can come from it, and prove Kenny Arrow wrong at the end of the day. With that, it's y'all's show. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody, one more round of applause while Dr. Chris Jones makes his exit. Thank you so much. So he talks a little bit about the importance of debate in the modern day and democracy. Today's debate features a lot about his specialty, law and economics. It's about China and the course that China and the United States are going to take going into the future. This will define how the 21st century turns out at the end of the day. I'm really excited to get into this. But first, I'm going to talk about the format of the debate, which is sort of, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the monk-style debate. Essentially, what we're going to do is, using the emails of which you guys checked in with, we're going to send out a poll via email to all of you on a proposition. And that proposition is, does China represent a threat to global security and Americans' interests? Now, they're going to talk about several topics, and it's going to be a little freewheeling, but essentially they'll all be couched under that umbrella. Do you agree or disagree that China represents a threat to global security and Americans' interest? So in a second here, I'm going to give you guys just a couple minutes for everybody that hasn't checked in to check in. I have codes at the table. We have a code to check in. We have a code to ask questions. There will be questions throughout the debate. And then we also have we have a little experiment that we're doing. We have a little market that you guys can make a bet in with play money. And it's kind of funny, but it'll produce some interesting data to see. But you guys can buy and sell throughout the debate. It's a little engagement, outside of the questions. But I'm going to give you now just a few minutes to check in, and then I'm going to send out the email. Thank you, and then we'll be back with our featured speakers tonight. Take your seats. Take your seats. We're about to get started. I want to first open this discussion by saying to please be quiet and respectful of our opponents here. We're very excited to all hear them, so we want to make sure we can hear them. But without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Matthew Batu, and he's going to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Name's Matthew. I want to thank all of you for coming out. This was an idea I actually had about I want to say 4 or 5 months. 4 or 5 months ago, I had this idea. I posed it to 2 of my friends who are very knowledgeable about this given topic. And I'm really glad we could showcase, freedom of speech, freedom of expression by having a respectful debate between 2 contrasting opinions. I'm gonna hand it off to Dom and Andy, whichever one wants to introduce yourself, Hello
everyone, my name is Dominic Selinsky. I'm an undergrad. My majors are econometrics and quantitative economics and international studies with a minor in intelligence studies. Oh, and I used to be I am the former vice president of JQA on campus. Hi, my name is Andy Harrison. I am an undergrad as well. I am a history and political science major with a focus in Latin American studies. I am the president of our philosophy organization on campus, and I'm really excited to have this wonderful debate with my good friend, Dominique Selinsky.
Yeah, maybe I should have introduced my major. I do EQE like Dom. I also do stats. I'm the treasurer here at 1AF. I'm also the treasurer for philosophy organization. I forgot. I should have given more of an introduction, but oh well. So without further ado, we're going to lead us off in this debate. The first topic of discussion we're going to be, presenting today is about whether the U.S. has the right to call out human rights abuses in China. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I guess one of the most pointed examples that could be brought up to mind is the Uyghurs in China. The Uyghurs are an ethnic Muslim minority that some human rights groups and the U.S. government have, pointed that the Chinese government is actually doing sterilization programs. They're taking away cultural relics and essentially trying to purge Uyghur culture. There's a lot of things with labor camps, and it's all going on. And the question is with the U.S.'s record on human rights abuses, should the U.S. have the right to call out such human rights abuses in China, or is this even hypocritical? So, without further ado, I'll have Don begin, and then Andy, you could follow up.
With regards to the human rights abuses,
yes,
obviously that was a problem in the past and currently still is a problem, right? But we continuously course correct, and that's what's wonderful about democracy, right? And our current system of government. We're able to assess the problems, we're able to assess the sort of violations that occur, and then through deliberation, right, enact policy to change that, right? That is something that isn't obvious in places like China, where the CCP has complete control and lives essentially in an echo chamber, right? We, or at least Congress, right, is beholden to the American people, right? And there's much to be said about the way activism has pushed forward the respect for human rights in the U.S., despite the problems that we currently have and have had in the past. Again, we've course corrected, but there's still problems.
All right, Andy?
I'll respond to that by just going a little bit kind of from a broader point of view, because I think kind of going from the frame of does the U.S. have the right to call out human rights abuses is almost kind of the wrong question to be asking, because I think there's 2 kind of disputes you can have from that, both from I guess you would call it pro-Chinese viewpoint and as well as a pro-American viewpoint. because from the pro-Chinese viewpoint, I would argue in a sense that the U.S. does not course correct on these kinds of human rights abuses. So, for example, if you consider the Iraq War in Guantanamo Bay, is those abuses that began with the Bush administration, for the most part, still continue today. People who were arrested, black bagged, kidnapped, and sent to essentially an extra-legal prison in Cuba, where they are not subject to the same kinds of protections that countries that are members of the international courts, the statute, for example, U.S. is not signatory to that. They're not protected under that. And people who were, again, arrested during the Iraq War under the Bush administration are still there today despite no proof of that. So from the viewpoint of someone in China, you could say, well, that's hypocritical, obviously, is that you can't say that the Chinese government does not course adjust to this when the U.S. also does not do that. But I'm not sure I would personally take that viewpoint. From the kind of more pro-American standpoint is, you could argue, and I feel this is more compelling, is that the viewpoint of going after China on human rights abuses is almost overly legalistic. And I'll explain what I mean, because a good kind of case study of this is the 2022 World Cup. Qatar, which hosted the World Cup, used what essentially amounts to slave labor from migrant workers, mostly from Southeast Asia, to kind of build these huge stadiums to host these, international football matches and stuff like that. It was found by multiple international groups that does, focuses on human rights and the legal definitions thereof, that it did not amount to human rights abuses, even though these people were working horrific conditions, essentially had no pay, had no ability to go back home, to opt out of the contracts they signed into, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to go after China on the very real abuses that are going on with the Uyghurs, you need to kind of focus on other avenues besides these people are suffering human rights abuses, because it's very easy to kind of obfuscate the real relations going on and say, oh no, actually these people in labor camps, for example, the Chinese government has said they've entered voluntarily into them, they're training in re-education for various jobs, their vocational centers, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to focus on what I feel is a more compelling argument is the actual work that goes on in these kinds of labor camps, for lack of a better word, is focus on the actual conditions thereof instead of focusing on what I view as a narrow, ballistic framework that can easily be changed on.
So when it comes to international norms, I wouldn't necessarily agree that just because China has had demonstrated human rights abuses, right, that we should necessarily go after it. I understand that argument, right? The problem is that this is pervasive. This has continued on, and it's been the same group in power for essentially since China gained independence, right? So I don't necessarily find the argument compelling that yes, this is hypocritical, hence you don't have a right to say anything, right? I find that problematic, firstly, because we do course correct. What's going on in Guantanamo Bay is problematic, but there are things that come from there that we don't have access to, right? There are a lot of issues in China that we do have access to, not through the transparency of the CCP, but because people who are there give us the access to this information, right? The Chinese intelligence network all around the world, right, is so pervasive in its abuses and extralegal killing or extrajudicial killings that, even for U.S. standards, it's enormous, right? Besides that, as it relates to the Uyghurs, right, I just don't see how China can use the mere argument that the U.S. doesn't have the right to respond to that as a way to whitewash what's going on there. It's still, as you said, it's still going on, right? The labor camps are not just there to train them and provide career development, they're there to indoctrinate them. A very interesting example is if you go to a mosque in China, right? Most of them have been they've been made Semitic, so to say, right? They've been reshaped and architecturally made to look more Chinese. And then you walk in, the first thing you see is CCP propaganda saying, it was something to the extent in English of "I love the state" and then I love Allah, right? And then you walk into the mosque, and then you're allowed to maybe, right, behind closed doors, practice your religion. Right, if you do it outside, I mean, it was CCP policy essentially to arrest anyone who had that looked criminal. What does that mean?
right? I understand that there are issues with the international rule-based order, but it's still there. It creates norms. These norms are enforced. People, essentially, my point is that the exception proves the rule, right? A lot of places are being pushed through Western investments, right, that are value-based to become more transparent, to essentially move towards a more democratically acceptable, not necessarily a democracy, right, but a regime and an economic system that has democratic values, right, such as the inherent respect for human dignity and property rights, which is something you will never find in China, and under CCP rule, you never will, right? So when it comes to human rights abuses, again, um, everybody has skeletons, understand that, but that isn't a strong argument. And again, the U.S. is open and transparent about a lot of these things, besides things that might have been that might be national security concerns that you cannot disclose. But that again is a limitation that has to be taken as necessary, right? I think you said something interesting there about norms kind of being created by states that are the exception to the rule. And I think you need to kind of, not you, but just generally, needs to kind of think about these kinds of norms through a historical viewpoint. Because, for example, in the case of the Uyghurs, I mean, the U.S. created the norm. The kind of persecution of Muslims in China was a direct outgrowth of the War on Terror. If you view through Jiang Zemin and some of the other premiers in China at the time, they directly sought American cooperation on persecuting Muslim communities in China. So I'm not here to kind of play the what about game, because I think you are right. It would be kind of remiss to say that Chinese human rights abuses or terrible labor conditions in China can't be criticized because the U.S. does the same thing. But I think the kind of natural question that follows up on that is the U.S. should call out Chinese human rights abuses is what does that actually entail? Does that entail sanctions, the barring of the Chinese state from multilateral institutions, God forbid, some sort of military intervention, that kind of thing. And I think both as we've seen in recent events with various Middle Eastern countries, with Russia, for example, is sanctions have a horrific effect on the civilian populations of these countries. I mean, China has 1 billion people, and it would be, if you're cutting them off from, like, for example, the SWIFT bank network or something like that, it would just see a huge decrease in, standards of living. It just horrific consequences would develop from thereof. But it would be, as you see in the case of Russia, for example, with the Ukraine war, it would pretty much be ineffective in securing policy change. In my opinion, it's just kind of leads to a shutting off of channels of diplomacy, of engagement, and other means of directly engaging with the state. So when we talk about the matter of human rights abuses in China, there does kind of need to be both an engagement on a multilateral level between various international institutions and things like that. And there also does kind of need to be a reckoning across the board. It can't just be, for example, we target one state that we have geopolitical differences with for human rights abuses when there are other states that we kind of let that slide, because then essentially that says to the state we're targeting is you actually have no incentive to change this because American foreign policy on one hand is cool with it in some cases, but because you disagree with them in certain geopolitical interests, such as in the case of Taiwan, you're going to be persecuted for that.
So to respond to the part about economic warfare, it's funny that you would say that. It's funny that you would say that because China by far wages more economic warfare than the U.S. ever does, right? The targeted attack, right, of having statewide isolation of groups is something that China has done many times, not for humanitarian or value-based reasons like the U.S. often does, right, but merely to push forward the CCP agenda. Right. I understand that there might be problems with the way that sanctions are done, which is why we've developed smart sanctions. Right. Not only that, but your point about comparing China to Russia is interesting to say that won't be an effect. The reason why sanctions don't work in Russia, right, is because the economy is pretty much self-sufficient, right? They are very much they depend on energy exports, right? But they have contingencies and they're able to move around and create their own financial institutions, although they're not comparable, right?
because their bottom line is already so low. China depends almost entirely on export. It is an export-led economy to the expense of the Chinese people, right? Their interests lie mostly in exporting labor because they cannot generate enough work at home because they don't have a financial system. It's all CCP based. You're only allowed to invest with joint government ventures that essentially are themselves led by CCP ideology, right? Um, to the point of, yeah, and to continue, if China were to be cut off, say, from food imports, right, which accounts for 3/4 of their entire agricultural base, that's that's already, it's going to cause a major famine, right? That's not something that Russia is concerned with. If you were to cut off petroleum or gas imports, which again, China is it's probably the largest importer of, right? Um, you would essentially destroy their economy because they depend on the entire petrochemical value added chain, right? They depend on petroleum imports. If you're able to blockade them, let's say, it doesn't necessarily need to be a coalition-based thing either. You just send a carrier either in the Strait of Hormuz or in the Bab el-Mandeb, so they don't have access to the places where they get oil from. That essentially will have long, pervasive, and systemic effects. We don't do that because we show restraint, right? China many times has violated, well, I can't even think of a single promise it's made on the international stage that is upheld, right? We exclusively let them join the WTO after they've begged the international community on the principle that they would open up their markets freely to other private companies. They have not done so. We ignored it, right? They continuously engage in corporate espionage. They don't even really hide it anymore, right? They continuously try to steal technologies, monopolize trade, and again, the mercantilist system that they have in place, right, is itself so parasitic that you can't say, oh, you don't have uh, uh, um, you don't have to worry about that simply because the U.S. has a similar or comparable issues, right?
There's a couple of points I'd want to respond to there. I think your point about Russia being largely a self-sufficient economy versus China, I think that's kind of eliding what I'm getting at. Because for me is, as you said, China would be devastated. There would be a famine. There would be mass shortages of oil and fuel and stuff like that. And in my opinion, that is something to be avoided. You should not subject a country of 1 billion people to essentially widespread famine because of the actions of a very horrible party that runs an authoritarian state. As you see in Russia, even though it does have a self-sufficient economy, um, it hasn't really affected the kind of regime change or even change in opinion within the population. And you would say it's because of its self-sufficient economy. In China, I don't want to kind of paint out, the entire Chinese population as kind of some sort of homogenous mass or something like that. But given the levels of party control there, you're essentially shifting the punishment of human rights abuses away from the kind of party elite onto hundreds of millions of people. And for what? You know, I don't think that would succeed in making the CCP change its opinions. It would just, write that off as kind of Western aggression. And I feel you would agree on that. Even though it engages, let's say, in corporate and espionage and, violations of world trade rules, does the average, migrant worker in Shenzhen deserve to, have food insecurity because of the actions of, Chinese elites? And I think your point about the Chinese financial system, I would disagree with that because the largest asset comp, bleh, the largest company with listed assets in China is not, Jack Ma's Alibaba or something like that. It's the ICBC, which is the Chinese-run state bank. And I believe the second largest firm is the state-run construction firm. So when you consider the level of financialization within the Chinese economy, the issue with the Chinese economy is not that, even though it is a primarily export-driven economy, that if sanctions happened overnight, it would, the regime would collapse or something like that. The issue with the Chinese economy and the politics that develop thereof is
almost kind of the same roots in many of the issues you find in the United States today. It's huge income inequality, and I think you kind of gestured to that towards talking about the export of labor because they aren't able to generate enough at home. The Chinese economic model has depended on huge amounts of GDP growth for basically the past 30 years. You know, kind of the after effects of both the Maoist regime and colonialism in China left the country hugely underdeveloped in its industrial capacity, basic infrastructure, roads, basically anything you could think of. And then in the 80s and 90s, it underwent a huge both marketization in special economic zones, which are essentially free market provinces centered around certain cities, as well as state investment in developing these kind of semi-independent firms able to develop Chinese infrastructure. So this huge amount of GDP growth resulted from this investment in Chinese development. And since now it's kind of tapering off, once you build road like a road, you're not going to build another road on top of that. The road's already there. Once you reach a certain level of infrastructure development, it just kind of tapers off. You see this GDP growth kind of fall off. And that, I feel, is kind of the root cause, for example, of this recent Chinese aggression in foreign policy, in the case of Taiwan, or even labor abuses and human rights abuses with the Uyghurs. And Michael Pettis, who is a economist who focused primarily on China, I think he has a pretty astute observation on how to deal with this. Is through diplomatic means, you have to encourage and try and pressure the Chinese state, not through sanctions, or not, however, to redistribute income to the billions and millions of Chinese people who do not have enough to actually drive growth. So I don't think you're going to see any kind of meaningful change with a sanctions regime imposed on China besides, the suffering of millions.
I'm gonna switch topics here a little bit because I think we've gone into a lot about human rights abuses. Andy, you mentioned something that I found was interesting. You thought that you contended that the slowing Chinese economic model as a result of like primary focus on development, China's very real estate dependent, led to some aggression in Chinese foreign policy. And you mentioned Taiwan. So I want to get into that, and I want to get into the defense of Taiwan. For those who are unfamiliar, Taiwan, broken off island, across the Chinese Strait there. There has been a lot of contention between China and Taiwan because does the international community recognize Taiwan as, an independent country? China doesn't see it that way. And there is a strategic interest that the U.S. has in Taiwan because, for those who are unfamiliar, 90% of semiconductors, which are these chips that are used for military technology, automobile technology, are produced in Taiwan. And the U.S. has long had a policy of strategic ambiguity, which is to sort of not recognize Taiwan as a country and not sort of like explicitly mention that they would be in defense of Taiwan, but it's kind of like, oh, it's implied there, right? But recently, there's been a shift with the Biden administration from strategic ambiguity to outright saying, yes, we will defend Taiwan. So, Dom, I want to ask you, do you think we should arm Taiwan to the teeth?
When you say arm, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like a strategic, not coalition, a cooperative sort of project where the U.S. is directly involved and trains and arms them, or simply FMS, like foreign military arms sales?
Probably mention on the former side of things.
The best way we can protect Taiwan is by allowing it to have some form of self-defense capability that provides that essentially forces China to show restraint, right? It is a deterrent if Taiwan is well armed, and it forces China to continue to engage in diplomatic ways of talking, right? Multilateral discussions, which are important if mixed with the understanding that the use of force would be a really bad play for everybody involved, right? The main idea with strategic ambiguity is actually one of the most constrained things the U.S. can do, because we're in a very complicated threat environment right now. If the U.S. were to decide, yeah, we're going to simply commit and say we're going to defend Taiwan in the case of an incident, right? That would embolden Taiwan to declare independence unilaterally, because they know that they have the largest security guarantor in the world behind them, and that China will likely not push for it. Now, if we say we won't defend Taiwan, China, with its let's call it very problematic history of virulent aggression towards Taiwan and just complete disregard for any of its neighbors in the South China area, will just send it, right? It will essentially have an amphibious assault. It will essentially send its fifth generation fighters like the J-20, and the conservative estimate, if Taiwan were to fight a war with China without the U.S. or Japan or any of the other sort of regional Indo-Pacific allies it has, would be a loss, right? Taiwan would lose. Realistically, that's not going to happen. Realistically, many agents, many players in that area have vested interest in ensuring that that doesn't happen. So China now has to contend with countries such as Japan, which has the largest deep sea navy in the world, right? Maybe not it doesn't have as many ships as China, but it has far more effective ones which can project far further out in the world, right? So they're able to stockade or sanction China in a way that would essentially shut the economy down. So there are many actors with their own interests in that situation. So strategic ambiguity keeps them all at bay from each other, and is a way to ensure peace. Right? There is no recourse. Yeah.
I think this is going to be the topic me and Dom have the least disagreement on, because I feel the kind of outgrowth of a lot of these kind of foreign policy developments in China, as well as you mentioned, Matt, Joe Biden's kind of recent turn towards and maybe not full out embracing, but kind of encouraging Taiwanese nationalist sentiment. It's all an outgrowth of, I feel, as I kind of mentioned earlier, essentially domestic politics, the economic outgrowths of things developing in China, in the United States, in parts of Japan, Korea, etc. And the policy of strategic ambiguity is, I agree with Dom here, it is the best recourse for peace in the region. Because if you mentioned microchips, right? Since the Chinese growth model is slowing somewhat, it's a lot. I referenced this earlier. A lot of it is related to a slowing down of infrastructure development in China. Is microchips is essentially a huge economic bounty for any government, as well as a geopolitical one. Microchips are an essential resource for a world that is technologically developing at a rate we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution, basically. So this kind of increased aggression towards Taiwan, and as Dom mentioned, in the far out scenario where no country gets involved with a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it would be a loss. What I think the Chinese brass essentially is aware of is that even if it did engage, let's say, in an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, that would be both a horrific loss for the Taiwanese people. It would be devastating, huge destructions of infrastructure, and more importantly, just millions upon millions dead. For the Chinese army, it would be a military disaster. It would be, even though you maybe take control of the island, it would be just complete chaos over there. So this kind of recent aggression was kind of hoping to push the United States into backing off on China and saying, okay, Tsai Ing-wen, who's the outgoing president of Taiwan, who is very sympathetic towards these Taiwanese pro-independence movements. You kind of need to cool off on your support for her and her related domestic movements. We're going to kind of bring Taiwan into a explicitly pro-Beijing sphere of influence. And then related to Joe Biden's, recent domestic struggles in the polls, has kind of taken a more, China hawk stance, which has led him to kind of embracing this movement in Taiwan. So this policy of strategic ambiguity of neither recognizing Taiwan as its own independent state, but neither recognizing it as a part of the Chinese government is a great strategy, and it helps kind of balance all the powers within the region, I feel.
Can I ask you so you believe that, just as a question, that you think that the reason why Biden has sort of pushed for less of a strategic ambiguity as a policy for Taiwan is because of poll numbers, and it's really to drive some sort of domestic or foreign policy accomplishment?
I think maybe poll numbers, I was a bit reductive with that, but I think if you look at the history of American foreign policy, and you see turns a lot of times to a more hawkish foreign policy or more aggressive foreign policy, a lot of it is in response to very real things that the target government is doing. In this case, China is very aggressive in the South China Sea. But you've seen this kind of turn in the I would say since 2015 under the Obama administration towards a more anti-China policy in Washington. The focus went away from our adventures in the Middle East, let's say, towards orienting ourselves towards Asia. And under Trump, you saw this very all over the place China policy that started out with him being very sympathetic towards Xi Jinping, and then at some points saying, we need to engage in a trade war with China. And then under Joe Biden, because I'm sure as you all well know, in 2021, we left Afghanistan, and that was not a great success for American foreign policy. If you agree with the interest of American foreign policy, the Taliban took over basically right as we left. Most Americans, if you look at the poll numbers, do kind of view Joe Biden as weak on protecting American interests abroad. So this kind of turn towards being more hawkish on China policy, I feel in some way, is an outgrowth of these kind of domestic concerns of people going into the 2024 election and saying, I can't really trust him to be strong and protect American labor from outsourcing. It's not really a thing that happens anymore, but it's still a concern for a lot of voters. I don't think he's able to protect American interest from this kind of growing power challenging American interest in the region. So I think this turn towards being much more aggressive to China is in some ways a response to real things going on there. But in the majority case, I would say, is a response towards kind of flagging domestic interests.
So Biden actually kept a lot of the protectionist policies that Trump had and actually added to that. So the current administration is actually one of the most protectionist administrations out there. To say that we are upping our aggression or hawkishness towards China and that we're simply shifting from the Middle East to the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific without mentioning the underlying cause, right, is disingenuous just because yes, we were committed to our regional allies in the Middle East, right? Afghanistan was a disaster, but the issue here isn't so much that we decided to refocus our attention. The reason, what's important is why, right? China continuously tried to undermine us. They started funding. They're trading with the Taliban, right? Like China's amoral interest, whether they be economic, financial, or political, has always been about furthering a authoritarian regime that is perfectly fine sacrificing tens of millions of lives if it furthers their own political agenda, right? What was the second thing you mentioned?
I don't know what you're referring to there.
What was the next point that you said after the Afghanistan dilemma?
I just made a point how I felt this kind of recent turn towards hawkishness and the increase of protectionist policy under the Joe Biden administration was related to this kind of view that he might be weak on foreign policy.
Oh, okay. So you're basically making the argument that we should worry about the polls more so than the policy, right? That it's more.
I think in the case of why this is happening is I feel we kind of underrate domestic developments compared to just purely engaging in this, realpolitik of, states engaging with each other and ignoring the real things that are developing in these countries.
Well, who's undermining or who's understating that? Like, who's the person doing that, right, or the entity?
I mean, since we're in a debate, I would say you, basically. I mean, in my viewpoint, again, I did state, in my opinion, that we are, in some sense, responding to real developments in Chinese aggression. But I feel that this kind of understanding of the CCP as, basically Satan on earth, essentially, is just kind of a pat moral story, able to kind of justify U.S. Intervention in regions such as Taiwan, and the reason why we see this kind of turn towards promotion of Taiwanese independence. So that's why I'm emphasizing real domestic developments going on in China, because instead of understanding, the Chinese government telos as like domination of East Asia because, they want to avenge the loss of Taiwan in 48, or it might have been 53 or something like
It's
that.
49.
49, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, fact checker there.
Yeah. For the loss of Taiwan in 49 is we need to understand the actual material factors kind of driving this. It's not just pure, well, these countries are pieces on a chessboard being moved around by these, grand masters of state or whatever. Is there are real things driving this outside of the direct control of, the president in Washington and the general secretary in Beijing.
Okay, so I understand that argument, right, which is something that Xi Jinping obviously failed to do. But your argument was that we are demonizing them, right? I would argue that for the most part, we've actually been quite lenient. Specifically, if you look at the promises they've made to places like Hong Kong and how they immediately reneged on those promises, you look at what they do to Macau, you look at what they said they would do after, again, going back to history, right? In 1955, we passed the Taiwan Security Act, right, or the Taiwan Defense Act, specifically because China just, or the CCP was just bombing that island for no reason again and again and again, right? And then we would send in a carrier, they would stop, and then they would say, we're not going to do it again. You're right. We should use diplomacy. We pull out, and then they bomb it again, right? After the three communique, right, where we basically had a period of rapprochement with China, which, by the way, happened because they betrayed their closest allies, right, with the Soviet Union. They essentially started a border clash, and once they realized that the Soviets would be willing to use nuclear weapons against them, Zhu and Lao went and talked to the prime minister and generals to say, look, we didn't mean it, right? And then they realized, all right, we can't suck out everything we want from the Soviet Union. Let us get closer to the U.S. That is when we started with the three communique, and that's when Taiwan became scared, and we gave the 6 assurances, which to this day are still used, or that Paul, those 6 assurances are still used as a way to draft policy moving forward. We still sell weapons to Taiwan, right? It's not like we're not doing that. But the reason for that is, first and foremost, China's disingenuous way of doing international politics, right? They have this idea that, yeah, they, again, the metaphor you use with the chessboards, right? When, forgot her name, a congresswoman went to Taiwan recently.
Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you, Nancy Pelosi. And Xi Jinping angrily called Joe Biden to tell him this is going to have repercussions. You should never have done that, right? Because he thinks that Congress is beholden to the president. He doesn't even understand that there is such a thing, right, as a pluralistic form of governance. He just sees it as a bottom-down kind of chain of command. So he called Joe Biden, basically telling him, this is your fault, you need to fix it. When Nancy Pelosi, as a congresswoman, has the mandate to go anywhere she wants, right? She is directly elected by the American people and isn't directly beholden to the president.
There's a few points I would disagree with there, but to start off with the last point you made about Nancy Pelosi and Xi Jinping, is I feel like saying that the idea of pluralistic democracy or liberalism itself is somehow basically understandable by the Chinese premier, that he's not able to grasp the idea that Congress people have their own remit to do what they want. I just think that's a bit like both reductionist and a bit orientalist to kind of say that Xi Jinping doesn't understand how Congress works. Because if you look at how the Chinese provincial system is set up, is that provincial governors and provincial leaders all the way down to the municipal level have their own kind of remit to do stuff like that. Not to the same degree of essentially setting foreign policy, per se, but they're mostly independent on the level of state parties. There is the National Party that does kind of set parameters for what, certain governors or mayors or what have you can do. But provincial leaders are able to have their own ability to kind of operate independently, and they're not just taking, they're calling up Xi Jinping every day and say, hey, boss, what do I do today? In the case of Nancy Pelosi and Xi Jinping's call to Joe Biden, the kind of implication of calling Joe Biden is essentially one of the faces of the party that you are nominally the leader of has gone on a trip to Taiwan independently and is, in the viewpoint of Xi Jinping, I disagree with this viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of Xi Jinping as essentially aggression against kind of strategic ambiguity of one China policy. And Ignaz basically telling him, hey man, you got to talk with her about this. I don't think that's somehow a misunderstanding of how other governments work on that part. So when I say I'm talking about this kind of, I didn't use the word, but I'll use it, demonization of China, I'm not saying we have to agree with what they're doing. but there does kind of have to be an understanding of their interests. We don't have to agree with their interests. We don't have to think they're moral, but we can't just go into the foreign policy realm and say that the Chinese government is essentially operating on the world stage out of moral wrongness. It is a self-interest in a sense, in the same way that almost all states operate. You know, from the viewpoint of the Chinese in recent years, is they've seen the United States take a more hawkish position on China. You say that's because of real responses to Chinese policy, and I agree with that. They've seen Japan become more hawkish on China, Korea, India, and in the case of India, they view that as a direct result of the United States talking with Narendra Modi, who's the prime minister there, and essentially turning them against the Chinese government. Whether you think that's legitimate or not, you know, that not up to me. That's what they believe in Beijing. So we have to kind of engage with China from the viewpoint of understanding their thinking in the same way that the Chinese government does, in some sense, try to understand Washington's thinking. They're probably wrong about how they interpret that. But the kind of struggle of international politics isn't to just go into any kind of engagement that affects the lives of millions of billions of people with just the viewpoint that, you know, China bad.
The U.S. is very much aware of Chinese interests, right? And when Xi Jinping called Joe Biden, it wasn't to let him know have a talk with Nancy Pelosi. He essentially threatened him. He said there are going to be repercussions for this, right? How dare you? It was personal. To your point about India, just wanted to address that. China has been engaged in low intensity border clashes with India for a really long time, and they are using the Belt and Road Initiative to basically infringe on Indian markets, right? They are building infrastructure with Chinese workers, right? And yes, India similarly has kind of a federal system where, you know, Modi is more like a first among equals, right? He's not. He can't necessarily tell a region you need to do this, right? So they get engaged, and then his power gets broken down. So yes, China is a direct and at times existential threat to India, regardless of what the U.S. does, right? And your point to say, yeah, about the whole idea that Xi Jinping cannot understand liberalism and how that's Orientalist. My point wasn't that he can't conceptualize it at all. My point is that the closer you move to power in the CCP, the more autocratic and totalitarian it gets. He essentially removed anybody who could challenge him, right? He got rid of Zhu Enlao's cadres and Jiang Zemin's cadres, anybody who could potentially present a threat to him. And they just either disappear, right? Or they are arrested for one reason or another. I don't think, again, I understand. Yes, socialism is like a niece or a cousin to liberalism. So it's not, I'm not saying that he can't understand liberalism. That was never my point. My point is to say that it is unfathomable to him to even begin to have something like that displayed in the world stage for his own people to see, which is why he pushes against it. Right? He is surrounded by sycophants, essentially, because he has either executed or pushed out anyone who would say anything against his policies. We're seeing the very same thing that happened with Mao, right? Where he essentially was in an echo chamber of people who wouldn't tell him what's actually going on. The Shanghai Institute recently published a study that proved that or showed that the Chinese Bureau of Statistics probably overcounted the population by 100 million people, right? How does that happen? How do you overcount 100 million people, right? It's essentially, again, just they fake the data, right? The same way they're faking the data with GDP to an extent. They're tweaking it, and they are forcing a narrative that Xi Jinping wants to hear to keep their jobs, to keep their livelihoods, because the closer you are to CCP, the more you need to be beholden to his specific strategies and policies.
Yeah, I just want to mention something that you addressed first. You said something about how the Belt and Road Initiative, which we'll get into in a minute, is sort of infringing on India's own trade markets and whatnot. So mentioning that, I kind of want to jump off to the Belt and Road Initiative as a topic because I think it would actually be a pretty frequent point of discussion. And maybe disagreement between you two. So, for those who are unfamiliar, the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a global infrastructure project created by the Chinese government. It has been going on since 2013. It's the 10th birthday, actually, of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, happy birthday to the BRI. And it is essentially It is active in 150 countries, and the Chinese government is essentially giving out hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans to establish, railroads, to establish trading ports and whatnot. And a lot of people have seen this and said, well, okay, this is a counterbalance to institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and this is promoting global trade. But then there's also been some who argue that this is essentially debt trapping diplomacy, and that a lot of these countries cannot pay back these loans, and there's frequent disagreements in countries such as Pakistan over these loans. So just on that disagreement, I want to ask you, Andy, what are your thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative as a force?
So I think the Belt and Road Initiative as kind of this international institution in counterbalance to already existing institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund is essentially useful in the sense of viewing it in relation to the IMF and World Bank. Because the IMF and World Bank, if you aren't familiar, were these kinds of institutions that dealt out, I would essentially describe them as basically predatory loans to countries in crises, where you would see in many cases, as in my specialty in Latin America, countries that were undergoing major economic recessions at the time. The IMF would come say, hey, we're backed, we're a multilateral institution funded by these various international countries, mostly by the United States. And if I remember correctly, up until the 90s, I believe Great Britain, and essentially say, hey, we're going to be able to refinance your country's economy on a very few select conditions. It was conditional aid. So in the cases of some of these countries, it was conditional in the sense that you need to liberalize your country. If it was an authoritarian regime, you need to kind of open things up to free elections. You need to stop, violating human rights with your military and stuff like that. But as was in the case in various Latin American countries, it was an economic program. So you would see in the case of Colombia in the 80s, in Mexico, briefly, I believe they turned down this initial loan offer. In Argentina, you would see the privatization of what were public resources of national institutions, kind of as an explanation as what that means. In Colombia in the 80s, you had like a guaranteed right to water. After the IMF came in, for a country that had been going through a recession for years at that point and had seen standards of living plummet, household incomes and your basic ability to save plummet, you now had to pay for water. And it was essentially unaffordable for hundreds of thousands of people. And in many of these cases, led to economic disaster. It didn't even fix the recession. Argentina, for example, one that went through many IMF restructurings over the decades, and some of this can be blamed both on the IMF as well as just the elected officials' malfeasance in their own economic policies. But they're in an economic crisis right now. They have some of the highest inflation in the world. In Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Soviet bloc, a lot of countries underwent a program that was called shock therapy that was proposed by a lot of these multilateral institutions as well as economists from the United States. That was basically like, okay, you have this system that was founded upon, mostly state intervention in the economy, state kind of controlled who got what, planned it out, not too much private property. So what we're going to do is go through economic shock therapy. We're going to massively liberalize the economy overnight. Prices used to be set by the government, so you know from day to day what the price was, if it was going to change or whatever. We're going to let the market decide that overnight. So in these various Eastern European countries, you just saw economic crisis throughout the 90s, just huge depressions because prices would skyrocket to levels that people were unable to afford on a day-to-day basis. You would see private firms that had made their wealth on essentially pilfering these countries during the Soviet period, just hoover up property that was now for sale. That's how you essentially got the oligarchs in Russia. So the influence of multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank has been pretty deleterious for a lot of non-Western countries over the years. And the Belt and Road Initiative and the various related institutions that kind of lend money related to China, it's not just this one initiative, there's various other ones, is able to serve as a kind of counterbalance to these institutions because it's allowing countries to kind of go up to either the Belt and Road Initiative or the World Bank or IMF and say, hey, if we accept this loan, I can get a better deal from the competing, let's call it firm, let's say, multilateral institution. I can get a better deal in refinancing my country's economy and helping me develop infrastructure, military bases, what have you, than the IMF. Because on the one hand, Belt and Road Initiative, what you see, as Matt mentioned in the case of Pakistan, is you would see Chinese firms, for example, developing ports in this country. They would be directly owned by Chinese firms. So it's not really bringing any money into the country. But in the case of the IMF, which recently Prime Minister Imran Khan rejected a proposed IMF loan to refinance Pakistan's economy, and then he basically got overthrown by the military. You would see a huge restructuring of Pakistan's economy along these very radically free market lines that would devastate millions of people's savings overnight. So what it allows for countries that are caught in between China or the United States, it essentially allows them a little bit of their own agency to go up to these institutions and say, oh, the IMF, you want me to privatize people's basic right to water. Well, I could go up to the Belt and Road Initiative and they're going to give me this loan, no questions asked. Or they could go up to the Belt and Road Initiative and say, oh, you want this to be owned by Chinese developers so the money goes back to China. Well, if I go to the IMF, they're not going to do the same thing. So it gives these countries an ability to kind of determine their own economic outlooks for the future.
So just to start, you had a lot of points. You've mischaracterized what the IMF and the World Bank are even supposed to be, right? They are part of, the IMF is a lender of last resort, right? It isn't supposed to be a developmental agency, right? That's the World Bank, and they've always provided responsible loans to, again, World Bank, not IMF, right? Responsible. Well, sorry?
I'd say neither has fulfilled that role of providing responsible loans.
Well, when I say responsible loans, right, the way these institutions work are that you have shareholders. They look at the risk, and according to how risky it is, they may want to increase or decrease interest payments, right? That just makes sense. That's how you raise capital. In the case of the World Bank, they've actually, at a loss, specifically the U.S., right, which is a major investor in the World Bank, at a loss, has paid for projects which have allowed countries such as Kenya to prosper, right? In the case of the IMF, you were talking about structural adjustment programs, which have been reformed. Yes, early on, the whole idea if you're undergoing a recession or if there's hyperinflation, the theory, and that was the overall consensus at the time from the major economic groups, right, was that yes, you would go into austerity measures, which is cutting down funding, cutting public schooling, etc. And that's not great. And now that we've through enough research and empirical proof, have realized that this does not actually work. They have reformed it, and they no longer have that sort of policy as it relates to structural adjustment programs. They don't do that anymore because they've realized it's a mistake. Again, in a liberal, rule-based world order, we can self-correct, right? In the case of the BRI, yes, you're absolutely right when you said they just give the loans out, no questions asked, right? If you think about where they're building those ports, right, in Sri Lanka, they built a multi-billion-dollar port in a place that nobody goes, which was essentially a vanity project because in that area, the person in the rule at the time, who was ousted and kicked out, his main voter base was in the southern part, right? So yes, the CCP and the way they use the Belt and Road Initiative, it's just a branding technique for something they've been doing before. Because again, they don't have the capacity, like you said, like once you build a road or once you build enough roads, you can't build any more roads, right? There are enormous amounts of vanity projects, and the way that the BIR has been weaponized, it is in fact one of the most irresponsible things a country like China can do, right? Right now they're undergoing a recession. There's a slow deflationary pressure there, and while they have written off a few of those loans or refinanced them, right? Offered refinancing packages, they've realized, okay, we're probably going to have to eventually seize assets just because, you mentioned that there is a financial market in China. The majority of that, right, is in real estate. You can't invest as a private Chinese citizen in projects that you believe work. It's just you have funding, the CCP uses it up, and then you have to deal with the burden later on due to inflation, right, because of what it does to the currency. The only way you can save as a Chinese citizen is by investing in real estate, which is why they have such crazy speculative bubbles there, right? Now, as it relates, again, back to your way of explaining that you can use the BRI to hedge The IMF again is a lender of last resort. Nobody else will touch, let's say, that kind of risk. So yes, it's going to come with certain guarantees. It's not great. It's not salient. It's not uh, uh, um, something that's very easily talked about, right? Who likes bankers? Sure, right? But at the end of the day, they're the ones who raise capital. They're the ones who are able to develop and create sustainable growth, right? Which is something that China not only doesn't necessarily care about, they just care about GDP growth on paper for the CCP, right? And even then, they care about political power even more so than that. So yeah, there is no local consumption, there is no domestic consumption, because the people just don't have the money. Because China is far more willing to invest in things like the Belt and Road Initiative because it gives them political and economic leverage, right? And again, it's not to completely discount what it has done, even though it hasn't wielded or secured any of the promises it has made. It did essentially lift a lot of people out of poverty, right? Not enough though. Most of the people who build these projects are Chinese companies, right? Most of the capital from building it, as you said before, right? That money flows back into China. Now, it doesn't matter if I have a highway if the population can't buy a car. It doesn't matter if I have a port if nobody goes to that port. The only reason they have these projects is because China is essentially a capital-based growth. It's based on capital growth, capital led growth, right? They don't really care about consumption the way we do. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, I get what you're saying. There's a few points I'd like to respond there. When you said China's in a recession, you're just wrong. Most economists define recession as 2 consecutive quarters of downward GDP growth, plummeting. China's GDP is still growing. It is slowed considerably, but it's not in a recession. So the idea that essentially all of the BRI's initiatives are purely an outgrowth of domestic politics, as I made this point earlier, I do agree with that in a sense. But the idea that the BRI is in some ways, in all ways, basically, just an attempt to boost up China's GDP growth numbers, I think is a little bit inaccurate. And you made this point about the IMF being a lender of last resort versus the World Bank. Yeah, that's fair. I think it was a little bit of a mischaracterization of my position to be like, oh, the IMF and the World Bank are interchangeable or something like that. But to use the case study of Pakistan, of how it's kind of a hedge or something like that, you saw this kind of orientation of Imran Khan, who was previously Prime Minister of Pakistan. He's in jail now. He was recently forced out of office, and essentially the Pakistani military, which is in huge ways supported by the U.S. government currently, is basically imprisoned him. He initially was pretty close to trying to orient himself towards the United States. There was proposed, international intervention in the Pakistani economy. But he made this point about how the IMF and World Bank have moved away from structural adjustment programs, have moved away from programs of austerity or something like that. As you said, the liberal international order can self-correct. In the case of Pakistan, it did not. There was a big push to kind of impose austerity measures on the Pakistani budget because they viewed it as an inflationary pressure on Pakistan's currency. And Imran Khan at the time, not to say he's like this great guy or whatever, he basically said no. So there was kind of a push to orient himself in his foreign policy more towards China, and then a few months later, gone. So this kind of idea that the IMF or World Bank are able to kind of adjust themselves to kind of the pressures of economy, to empirical research. I'm not denying and saying that that's not the case whatsoever, but when we look at their actual case record, what they've done to a lot of these countries, it has not been too successful in actually encouraging sustainable growth. The BRI, considering it's only 10 years old, as you said earlier, happy birthday, hasn't really had the long-term ability to look at whether it's been successful in creating sustainable growth. Sri Lanka, for example, as you mentioned, port in the south of the country, hugely unstable political regime there. It was backed by China. There's a little bit of U.S. involvement in backing that regime too. It's in complete chaos now. So that's kind of an unstable way to look at the BRI and say, oh, we can kind of, pass, fail, and say it worked, it didn't. In the cases of countries in Africa, and I think you are right about this. It is kind of a tool of essentially driving up Chinese growth, but at the same time, there has been benefits of introducing new flows of labor, of cash into certain economies. It's primarily Chinese developed. It's not perfect. I'm not going to pretend and say it's good. Altogether wholly great, but compared to this ability of the World Bank, the IMF previously to kind of dictate the terms of how these countries would be able to develop their economies unilaterally, this kind of double, as you called it, a hedge between these two kind of groups of institutions allows for these countries to able to determine their own pathway in a world that's increasingly polarized between the United States and China, when it used to just be United States hegemony.
I also wanted to bring it back to the shock therapy that you talked about before, right? In that specific example, it was already an inherently corrupt system, and the oligarchs were just waiting, right? So shock therapy, yes, was horrible, right? Like that wasn't necessarily an effect of liberalism or the international or international financial institutions, right? A lot of them pushed for it, but at the end of the day, it's the countries that decided to go for those shock therapies. And then to talk about Pakistan, yes, so the government was subsidizing gas in a way that's unsustainable. I mean, it's a great thing in theory, right? It's a great thing to have affordable gas for the people. But if you're going to finance it by just printing money or by essentially selling off your assets, right? That or to international buyers, that is not a sustainable way of doing it, and that is just pure politics, right? That has nothing to do with economics or what's actually good for the people. You create a narrative, you create a populist persona, and then you just throw money at it. It's the same thing Chavez did, right? It completely ruined the economy. I mean, again, the comparison is Norway and Venezuela, right? They both had massive endowments as it relates to petroleum, right? But one decided to actually create a sovereign wealth fund and keep paying into it with a certain amount of the earnings they get from petroleum. The other one decided to just spend it on any vanity project, right? Now, I'm not saying, again, that it's bad to help people pay for their living. I'm saying if you're not able to, you shouldn't try to. And if you ask for money to do that, a lot of people would be reticent to do it because they realize pretty quickly this person's only doing it for their own gain, right? And the reason why Imran Khan got arrested was because there's an enormous. Yes, there are a lot of power plays in Pakistan, right? There are a lot, but he also committed a few financial crimes, right? Let's not kid ourselves. And his shift towards China was mostly because he realized they wouldn't ask questions. They would just build and build and build because it benefits them and it benefits him. And then again, with regards to your theory on the hedging, you're right. It does position countries in a way that allows them to play to global superpowers as they've done during the Cold War, right? That's fine. But what you're essentially choosing is a free loan, no questions asked, for a kleptocratic or authoritarian government, right? Most of the weapons that are now provided to authoritarian or military juntas in places like Gabon or Mali, a lot of those come from China because they don't have a problem funding governments that have far worse human rights abuses than would ever be considered acceptable, even within, like, let's say, Saudi standards, right? The U.S. doesn't worry about that, and in that case, the U.S. doesn't play the same way that China does. And in that case, I would actually argue that the U.S. Will not be hedged into a position where they need to sell or offer a better deal. We just don't engage in arms deals, or we don't sell to governments who don't follow or help us push for a liberal world order. Now, I know I'm going to mention Saudi Arabia as an example, or Yemen, right? We joined, perfect example, we joined the coalition that was initially Saudi-led in the bombing campaigns in Yemen because we thought that we could steer it away and humanize it in a way, right? We thought that, yes, Saudi Arabia has been committing essentially war crimes, and if we get involved and we dictate where the drone strikes happen, we could prevent more loss of life. That didn't work. Saudi Arabia just kept doing what they did, and then we pulled out of it because we realized we're simply emboldened them. China doesn't care, right? Their investments in arms trading and arms sales, even like the quality itself is already like really problematic, and it breaks down much faster than comparable units made by, let's say, the U.S. or France. They will just sell it to anyone, right? Because yeah, it provides them a hedge, and yeah, they don't care.
Eddie, I'm gonna let you briefly respond, and then we have to get to audience questions as a result of time.
Sure. I'll just briefly touch upon a few things. So the first thing I'd like to touch upon is your mention of arms deals to Saudi Arabia and saying we did that to kind of humanize the Saudi regime a little bit, introduce kind of more liberal frameworks, and kind of direct the course of the war, the drone strikes. I'm not sure if I agree with the idea that giving an authoritarian regime guns to commit what amounts to genocide in Yemen is a kind of effective way to liberalize it. And now I hear your counterpoint is that China does the same thing with its own loan program. So from the viewpoint of the average person, let's say in Pakistan or Mali, I can either, let's say my country is faced with either getting the opportunity of a World Bank loan or an IMF loan or a BRI loan. So on the one hand, I can either get a loan from the IMF or World Bank, which I would still argue generally imposes austerity measures on a country's economy. You mentioned gas subsidies. So if I'm able, under, let's say, this gas subsidies program, able to save up more, improve my standard of living, but my country's economy is going down the toilet, we can either accept this one loan that will ruin my standard of living and my livelihood, or the Chinese government, which is coming up to me and saying, we don't know what the Chinese government is here for. It's self-interest, but essentially we're going to give you this money, and what you choose to do with that is your own choice. It's the country's own sovereign choice, not imposed on them. Because this question of the United States or with China dealing and giving loans to countries that commit human rights abuses. Again, not to get back into what about is, but you obviously mentioned the case of Saudi Arabia. We tend to get involved as the world's largest arms dealer into a lot of countries that commit horrific crimes across the globe, and then kind of imposing a sense of, with these cases of World Bank or IMF loans, essentially a slow kind of regime change of imposing a particular worldview on them, versus China, which is naked self-interest, but it's at least a naked self-interest you can deal with. You know what they're there for. And what a government chooses to do with that money is up to the government's own decision. It is respecting the sovereignty of that country.
Just 5 minutes or 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes.
So one thing that's important also to remember is that when we conduct those arms sales, it becomes vetted, right? And we're actually improving the way that we're selling them. Again, yes, I understand that there are historical precedents as to why, as to why we made those mistakes. But nowadays, you will not find the U.S. selling weapons to a country like, let's say, Niger or Mali because of the way they treat their local population. You will find China do that, right? And we are actually pulling away slowly from Saudi Arabia and the arms sales because we've realized, yeah, we put the strategic interest in front of the humanitarian interest, and that had repercussions.
You said slowly pulling away? You said like slowly pulling away from these arms deals.
Yeah.
Are we still doing these arms deals?
We're slowly pulling away.
So we're still doing them.
Well, the thing is, if you have an agreement, right? If you have a 10-year contract, you can't renege on the contract, right? But if you want to pull out of it, you can decide not to sell another contract, or you can decide to impose certain, let's say, contract adjacent sanctions, right? But you can't renege out of it because it's been a deal that's made. If the moment you pull out of it, it's basically like not paying your loan. Now, with the IMF, and a really important thing to remember with the IMF and the World Bank, one thing they provide is they force the countries to be transparent in the way the regimes to be transparent in the way that they use that money, and they force them to have regulatory entities that take care of the financing and allocation of funds for private or public projects. That's something you don't have with the BRI, and that's something that essentially allows people to just fill their pockets, right? Because yeah, China doesn't necessarily, or the CCP doesn't necessarily care about where or how that money is spent. It's a loan, right? We will build for you. You can invest in us, but here is, again, like you said, a blank check. This is the set amount you have. You could spend it how you want, right? on the condition of you spend it on these Chinese companies, right? And that the material should come from here, right? Again, like you get my argument, right? Like it's not necessarily. I'm just going to cut it off here, but that's just my point, right? You need to make sure to understand that there's transparency involved here that you will not find in a CCP sanctioned loan.
All right. So to comply with MSC policies, we're going to get to the question segment portion of this. So thank you for everyone for submitting questions. We only can get to 2 because of time purposes. I would encourage brief responses. Okay. So the first question I'm going to ask is to Dom. So Dom, to what extent do America's actions in the Middle East affect China's ambitions in the region? That was a question you received, and thank you for whoever submitted that question. Thank you.
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's to what extent have America's actions in the Middle East affected China's ambitions in the region?
Well, I would say they've emboldened them, right? Because China realized that, again, they're a hedge. You're able to engage with them, and while the Americans, do the fighting or provide the security umbrella, China can come in and do behind the or under the table deals under the auspices of American security. That's what they did in Afghanistan. That's something that they actually did in Iraq. And now that we're not reneging on our security guarantees on our allies in the region, with our allies in the region. But we are shifting our attention more towards a more existential threat, which is in the Pacific, which is China, right? Because of the offenses and the sort of, again, virulent disrespect that China has for rule-based order, right? We've given them many, many opportunities, and they're far more interested in quick financial gains, as seen in the Middle East, right? Right now, they're engaging with trade with the Taliban, and they're actually building projects and have joint projects with the Taliban.
It's like a Birdman movie. You remember you see that movie? Great movie.
Anyways, yeah, I would say that it has emboldened it just because it realized that this is an operational environment where Chinese business dealings would thrive rather than die out.
So I guess your contention is that like through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, which have encouraged, China's been doing like economic development projects in Africa and the Middle East for like decades at this point. You're saying that the U.S. now has like even more of a vested interest to participate in the Middle East because of China trying to expand its influence in the region.
The U.S.?
Yes, the United States.
Not necessarily. So we recently saw a very brittle deal that was brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? Which was brokered through China. The underlying agreements there are very brittle, and it is essentially just a political play, right? Saudi Arabia is already increasing its diplomatic ties with a place like Israel, just because they realized eventually that the U.S. is not going to keep funding them and their military incursions to fight Iran, right? So, I wouldn't say that it would force the U.S. to stay in the region. We already have our security guarantees. China is the threat to Saudi Arabia, right? But yeah, that'd be my response.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so we're gonna get to the second question. Again, thank you for everyone who submitted a question. Unfortunately, due to time purposes, we can only emphasize 2. So this is a question to Andy. So you have derided sanctions as an attack against the innocent people of China. Do you think the same is true of targeted sanctions on specific high-ranking individuals within the CCP? If so, you mentioned diplomatic pressures as a means to curb China's behavior. Could you describe what these diplomatic pressures would look like and how they would have teeth?
So I think the kind of targeted sanctions, or as Dom mentioned, smart sanctions you see previously put in place in that it was first tested out in Iraq in the 90s and then very recently applied to Russia after the initial Crimean invasion in 2014, is I do think they are generally more effective than I would say just blanket sanctions on an individual country. But the issue is that they still don't really get the job done. Because kind of as you see in the case in Russia after 2014, in Iraq in the early 90s after the Gulf War, is that you see individual party elites in these countries get kind of a little bit of pressure on them Then a lot of times, since these are authoritarian states, you just see these kind of party members get replaced by other cadres. So you might see individual businessmen or individual party leaders, have a hard time, setting up businesses abroad or something like that. But the business still lives on. The party still lives on, that kind of thing. And when we talk about, to the second part of the question, when we talk about kind of diplomatic avenues of, dealing with Chinese aggression, is you kind of you have to engage with them meaningfully through multilateral institutions. It has to be a little bit of give and take. And as painful as I think that might sound to a lot of you, is past kind of direct sanctions, as I've already stated my point on this, they don't really work, and they just blanket sanctions tend to lead to just mass civilian immiseration. But there has to be a kind of engagement outside of that. So how do you do that? So as you see in previous kind of Cold War developments during the 20th century, you saw the United States occasionally engage with the Soviet government over, whether that's the Berlin blockade or other stuff, and events that could have led to just outright nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, since my focus is on my own studies is on Cuba, is I think a perfect example of this. It was the closest we had ever been in human history to outright just destruction of all life on Earth. But a deal was made between the United States government and the Soviet government, was Khrushchev in power at that time, to take nuclear missiles out of Cuba and take United States nuclear missiles out of Turkey. So that kind of give and take there is kind of what's necessary in the case of something like China. Strategic ambiguity, which we talked about earlier, is almost a perfect example of this. There needs to be, in the case of China, a not outright recognition of Taiwanese independence, but neither a just kind of throw them to the wolves kind of deal. So in the case of dealing with states like China, you can't go into it thinking essentially they're a moral evil and they need to be wiped out of existence. We need to overthrow the CCP and engage in regime change or something, nor essentially just say, hey, no sweat off my back. It's out of our hands. There needs to be a middle ground where through direct engagement with the government, not through a shutdown of diplomatic ties, which is what occurs when you impose sanctions. It's typically actual, embassies and all that stuff is severed. It needs to be a direct push and pull agreement reached between two nations.
Yeah, I think that's what we're gonna call it. Appreciate everyone for, um, being here and engaging. I'm going to, can we get a brief round of applause for our debaters and everyone here? Thank you, thank you. Again, I appreciate all of you for taking the time. I'm going to pass the mic off to Tyler.
All right, before you guys go, we're going to do our second poll, and that's going to be how we're going to decide the winner. Who swung more people over to their side? Now, if you guys understand statistics, you know that when you have some people go, they're not going to be taking the poll the second time. It's problematic, but we're going to do it anyways, because that's the format of the debate. And I'd like to declare a winner personally, because we ordered a championship ring. We got to use that. Right. I sent the poll out, so I'm gonna give you guys just a few minutes. You guys can talk amongst yourselves. Decide how you think about this proposition now that you've heard our two speakers.
What? So distance, a wildcat did brown to approaching. The wind began to.
So I think I may have accidentally sent two polls. Only look at the one with the subject line poll number 2. That's the relevant one. Good. Just give you guys one more minute. It's the same. It should be the same question. It's supposed to be the same.
Welcome to your life. It's no time in danger. Even when we say we will do it. It's my it's my it's it's help me.
All right. Our responses are in. And with a swing of roughly 11%, Dominique Solinsky is tonight's winner. Now, the ring has, thanks to Amazon, has not actually arrived yet. However, we have this special Create Positive Change button from the CLCE. Positive change. The button of change, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dominic Solinsky.
Thank you.
Sat and had big, stick by us for the entire time. This has always been as an experiment, so no hard feelings to the people who left. We just thought this would be something fun to try, and we might try it again, with another topic. But man, thank you to our contestants, Dominique Solinsky, Andrew Harrison, and our moderator, of course, Matthew Batot. I am so glad that you guys all came out today. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
Sure.